Dr. Charlotte Pence. I am the director of the Stokes Center for Creative Writing here at the University of South Alabama. And I also direct the creative writing program here at South Alabama. And we are so happy today to have Eduardo Corral give us a craft talk on reimagining revision. So I'll tell you just a couple of details about Eduardo. His debut collection of poetry, Slow Lightning, won the Yale Younger Poets Prize, making him the first Latino recipient of the award. And his second collection, I cannot recommend it enough, Guillotine, that just came out in 2020, is praised for its seamless blending of English and Spanish, tender treatment of history, and careful explorations of sexuality. Corral has received numerous honors and awards, including the Discovery the Nation Award, the J. Howard and Barbara M.J. Wood Prize, and the Witting Writers Award, and also a fellow from National Endowments for the Arts. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eduardo.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us today for this talk and then conversation. Thank you, Dr. Pence, for the invite to visit the Stokes Center for Creative Writing. Thank you so much. One of the best things, when I was an undergrad first stumbling into poetry, discovering poetry, I loved to go to poet talks, writer talks. They were my favorite things to attend to. Even more than the readings themselves, the conversations and the questions asked were so amazing. I never raised my hand though as an undergrad. I regret that. I had people like Ed Hirsch in front of me, Bei Dow once in front of me at Arizona State University. I should have asked something because now Bei Dow is one of my big favorite poets. But before I begin my talk, let me say a few things, right? As a teacher of creative writing, right? As a mentor to other writers, I believe in giving very practical advice, strategies that you can enact right away in your vision writing life. I encourage you to try these strategies out, and if necessary, to modify them, to make them your own. When I first started writing poetry as an undergrad at Arizona State University, I started reading and writing poetry simultaneously, but also at the same time, I started reading interviews. I don't know why. I started reading interviews with writers, poets and writers, as the same time I began reading and writing poetry. And that was such an immense, important moment for me, because from the get-go, I realized there's no one way to be a poet in the world. And two, there's no one way to write a poem in the world, right? So I really encourage you to let it become a habit. Read interviews with other writers, right? Because they will nourish you, challenge you, and comfort you on your own journey. Right? Another thing I want to briefly say is, I think for all writers, especially poets, it's very important for us to interrogate our bonds with language. It can't be just overly romantic bonds or notions or assumptions that we have about language itself, the material of words, of language. I am a poet who distrusts language. Yes, I'm enthralled by it. I see its beauty, how sublime it is, right? But I also distrust it. Why? Because I am the son of Mexican immigrants. Growing up in Southern Arizona, I heard all these horrible things about Mexicans and immigrants. I would go home to my parents and say to myself, that's not true, right? When I came of age and realized I was a gay man, a gay boy, right? I remembered all the horrible things I said about gay individuals. I said to myself, you're not that, right? So I have always had a natural, healthy mistrust of language, right? You should be asking yourself continuously, right? How has language shaped and misshaped you? How has language hurt you? How have you used language to hurt others, right? So the bond with language is rich and complicated. It's not just one-dimensional, right? We see its beauty, its power, its bewilderment, right? And also its darker power and forces, right? If that kind of makes sense, right? That's, I think, is very key for writers, especially poets, right? To really interrogate their bond with language. Today, I'm going to talk about a handful of revision strategies. What I really mean is being attentive to our language, to the process, right? I'm going to clarify what I mean by attentiveness in a bit. But before I begin revising, I have to what? Write, right? I have to generate a draft. I was talking to this to Dr. Pence's class earlier this week, right? I have kind of a, well, we'll talk about it a bit, right? For me, when I start drafting, right, I have to draft by hand, right? The first 8 or 9 drafts have to be by hand, right? Then I leave to the laptop. I cannot start drafting on a laptop because the pristineness of the screen tricks my eye. I feel like I've already been published online somewhere, all right? My mind says, good, another publication, move on, right? No, I don't like that, right? But this is very generational. My MFA students mostly draft on their devices, right? So it's a very generational approach, right? But when I'm writing those first 8 or 9 drafts by hand, right? I do something that's very important for me, right? I shut down the analytical part of my mind, right? When you analyze something, what are you doing? You're breaking it apart into its components, seeing how each part works individually, and then how they all kind of dovetail together. That's great when you're writing an essay. It's not really great when you're putting together a draft of a poem. During the drafting process, I am generating. I want to put things together, braid things together, collide things together, right? And also by shutting down the analytical part of my mind, I shut down the inner critic, those voices, right? And I've trained myself to really push hard against that little voice inside my head, right? If the little voice says during the drafting process, this is too funny, this is supposed to be an elegy, a sad poem, I push against it. I say, oh, you think that's funny? Let me give you another joke, right? If it said, the little voice says, this is too grotesque, this is too strange. You think this is grotesque and strange? Let me show you what grotesque and strange can look like. I actively push against that little voice, right? Because I have shut down that analytical, right? That comes later during the revision process. But when you're putting things together, graft, braid, enlarge, right? Then after I have a draft text that I know can withstand my revision process, I leap to my laptop, right? And this is where I start my revision process, which I'm going to talk to you right now. Let me share my screen with you, please. Technology. It's a beautiful, scary thing. Can everybody see this? Charlotte? Dr. Pence? Yes. Okay, my talk today is called Pouring Language in New Containers, Revision Strategies, right? I've learned to give everything a subtitle as an academic. Everything has a subtitle, right? So a good job, MFA program, right? Today I'm going to talk about a few things, but it's really about attentiveness to, 1, attentiveness to the revision process. 2, attentiveness to the poetic line. 3, attentiveness to sentences. Poets often don't pay attention to sentences, but you have to be hyper aware of sentences for your lyric poems, your narrative poems, to really do interesting work at the level of language, syntax, and diction, right? And 4th, attentiveness to music, right? Sonic pleasures. Revision can mean taking out words, reordering lines, or it can mean adding new language, rethinking subject matter, or a mix of this or something else, right? Revision is not just subtraction. Revision is not just tinkering. Revision is not just remixing. Each draft teaches us something. Each draft nudges us forward. Each draft helps us become more attentive. Revision is the process of acquiring more insight into your aesthetics, your approach to craft, and to language. And the wonderful thing about revision, if the current draft, if you don't like the current draft, what do? You just go back to the previous draft, right? You have lost nothing, but you have gained a little incremental knowledge about how you think about language. And that adds up over the process, right? It really, really becomes powerful. Revision helps us become more aware of our strengths, our weaknesses. Yes, the process can be incremental. Yes, the process can be frustrating. I understand that, right? I've lived through it. I live through it now, right? Still, as a practicing poet. But it was important for me. It was a huge breakthrough for me to rethink the revision process as a site of wonderment, agency, and discovery, right? To rethink revision as wonderment, agency, and discovery. For me, revision is my favorite part of the writing process, right? Is where my language really, really becomes what it needs to become, right? How can you become more attentive to the revision process? When I have that draft, the 8th or 9th draft that I've written out by hand and I leap to my laptop, I start doing what I call pouring language into new containers. If that draft is in couplets, the next draft of that poem is in tercets. The third draft is a lyrical paragraph. And the 5th draft scatters the language across the field of the page, right? Again and again, I'm pouring my language into new containers, but each new container has a different line length, which is very key to this process. So each container forces me to rethink the syntax and diction of each line. The poetic line is the foundational unit for poets, right? So this strategy, right, forces you to attend to syntax and diction again and again, right? What am I doing? I'm putting pressure on my lines, rethinking my language, finding, to quote Stephen Dobbins, the right words in the right order. Isn't that beautiful, right? That's all a good poem is, the right words in the right order. But how hard the task to find the right words in the right order, right? But pouring my language in new containers is how I wrote my first book and how I wrote my second book, Guillotine, right? Because this process made me hyper attentive to my lines. If you can write a good line, you can write a good stanza. If you can write a good stanza, you can write a good poem. It begins with that line, right? Try this approach, right? Or modify it, right? Or ask yourself, how is my revision process helping me become more attentive to my lines, the way I use syntax and diction? I've always loved Carl Phillips' definition of syntax, a system that delivers and delays information. Isn't that quite lovely? I like the delays is my favorite part there, right? Let me give you a brief example. What does that look like for me, for my work? In my second book, there's a poem called Autobiography of My Hungers, right? When I leapt to the laptop, the 8th or 9th draft was in tight couplets like this. In high school, days after my first French kiss, my madre said I was skinnier than a broom. The second line has a radical enjambment, right? There's a specific kind of kiss. There's a use of Spanish. Madre is a Spanish for mother, right? I'm not very happy with that, I was skinnier than a broom moment, but it's part of the drafting process, so it stays for me until I revise it out, right? But the draft that went onto the screen was very tight couplets. Then I poured all that language into irregular tercets, right? A few días after my first kiss in 11th grade, my mother said I was looking thinner. That noche, I whisked a box of shiny donuts into my room. I thought of, right? The language has become more elastic, right? I stretch it across the tercets, I contract it and stretch it out again, right? This is me again playing with the language. And if the next draft of that poem is a little lyrical paragraph, right? I did this for, I think, 7 or 8 times. I poured this draft into 8 or 9 containers. And eventually there's a breakthrough, right? What I originally thought was the poem's beginning, I realized, oh no, that's not the beginning of the poem. That's later on in the poem, right? So the process helped me to come up with something this right here. This is very close to what the poem actually looks like in the published form, right? It took me about 8 or 9 pouring into different containers to arrive to this shape and to finally pare down the language again to the right words in the right order. But not only was I paying attention to the poetic line and my syntax and diction, by pouring the language into new containers, I realized what I thought was my beginning was really near the end of the poem, right? A pivot toward the end, which was very important for me, which helped me what? Rewrite the thing, the poem itself. So think about this notion of pouring language in new containers, how it help you become more attentive to your poetic line, right? But when I'm drafting, when I'm revising, excuse me, and pouring my language into all these new containers, there's so much pressure on the poetic line. I have to ask myself, well, what do you think is an interesting line? What's an interesting line? Notice I don't say good, right? I say interesting. I don't say good or bad. I say an interesting line. I think it's more neutral way of thinking of the poetic line, right? For me, an interesting line does two things simultaneously. First, something along the line, something about the line pushes you along the line. There's movement, propulsion, right? The line has energy. It moves you along its length, right? It could be the music, the monosyllabic words. The words just click forward beautifully. It could be narrative or lyrical momentum, right? So there's something about the line that is pushing you along the length of the line. Also, there's something about the line that makes you want to linger over the line. Caesura, insertion of white space within the line, punctuation within the line, right? A striking imagery that just stops you, pauses you, right? Unexpected diction, right? So at the level of craft, right? The line moves along the length of the page. You're moved along the length as a reader. And then there's something also at the level of craft that makes you linger over the line. The simultaneous desire to push forward and to linger enriches and complicates the line. That tension often makes, in my opinion, for an interesting line, right? And when I'm pouring my language into containers, which forces me to rethink my syntax and diction at the level of the line, this is what I'm thinking about often. How can I make this line interesting? What about this line is moving me through it? What about this line is helping me, encouraging me, forcing me to linger and pause somewhere along the line? That tension there, right? It's very important, I think. That said, rules are meant to be broken. Some lines you want the reader to zip along quickly, and some lines you want to stop them cold, right? So this is not a steadfast rule, but this kind of notion of what makes a line interesting helps me during the revision process, come up with more interesting variations of the line, possibilities for the line, right? That tension between movement and pause and stillness, right? It makes for really rich, complicated poetic lines. Here are some examples of lines that I love, right? The first one is from one of my first teachers as an undergrad at Arizona State University, Norman Dubie. This is from The Funeral, an elegy for one of his aunts, right? The line is, the cancer ate her like horse piss eats deep snow. I have never forgotten this line. I read it over 20 years ago. It has never left my mind. The cancer ate her like horse piss eats deep snow. The first word that pauses me is the word cancer. We see that word, right? Our heart quickens, we stop, what fear kind of approaches us, right? Then the word ate her. Cancer personified? Cancer eating something, someone? And then the simile, right? Like horse piss eats deep snow. Utterly unimaginable until you read it. It would never have dawned on me to compare the process of tumors, cancers to horse piss eating deep snow. But the grotesqueness of the simile aligns, overlaps with the grotesqueness of cancer itself. So in the end is a stunning line and simile that just keeps stopping you, right? It just stops and stops you, right? This is an example of a line that you don't move across really quickly, right? the simile and the diction itself pauses you time and again. Another way to incorporate a to linger over a line, to force the reader to pause, is to just use punctuation. Right? It's one of my favorite tricks. Right? This is by Tafia Fazula from our wonderful poem, 100 Bells. Die, period. I shaved my head, period, until the horns. Yes, this is it, right? Punctuation itself is what is forcing us to pause, to linger, right? But the line itself is such an interesting linguistic unit. Die, I shaved my head until the horns, right? So even though there are all that punctuation there that's forcing me to pause, right? To honor that grammar, right? The punctuation, the language itself is really interesting, right? I want to see what's next, right? So there's pause, stillness here, and I'm also curious because until the horns is incomplete, right? The sentence is incomplete. So I want to what? Move forward, right? So it has that tension in my mind. Another line that I love is by Lucy Brackbreuder from her poem, Infinite Riches in the Smallest Room. The rims of wounds have wounds as well. I have loved this line it's like that first line, right? I read this line years ago and it has stayed with me. The rims of wounds have wounds as well. This is just cadence and music propelling you so beautifully across the line, right? The rims of wounds have wounds as well. Isn't that just gossamer in the mouth, right? It's so gorgeous. It just pushes you along so beautifully, right? But in a it takes its time. It has its own cadence and pace, right? It's not really quick, right? It just slowly unfurls, all that music slowly unfurling along the line, right? A final example is from Dion Brand, from her book-length sequence called Inventory. Rubber and metals, the total contents of the brain, the electrical, right? Here is like normal words repurposed for a surprising kind of conclusion or statement. Rubber and metal, the total contents of the brain, the electrical, right? I'm surprised, right? I'm surprised how the ordinary has been refreshened and made new to me, right? So that keeps me moving along the line. It makes me hungry for what comes next, right? Again, we have the use of punctuation as a way to pace out the surprise of the language, right? And to pace out how it accumulates into a complete, surprising linguistic unit. Some brief examples of how a line can move you along with its music, right? And examples of how a line can completely stop you, right? And a mix of both, right? Hope that was, I love these lines. I always carrying them with me. Okay. Okay, besides pointing language into new containers, how else can you become attentive to a poetic line? I keep what I call a line notebook, a little line notebook. In this notebook, I write in lines from other poets that I read that I like, that I find beautiful, that I find confusing, that I find bewildering. Something about that line this other poet wrote calls to me. Right? So it goes into my poetic notebook, right? And when I have time, right? I finish watching a show or have extra time before class, between classes, I go through this poetic notebook and I pay attention to the line and I try to puzzle out what about the line is calling to me, how the line is working by itself, right? But even before that, the very act of writing by hand, a line that calls to your attention, that calls to you, right, is very beneficial, right? You're training your hand, right? You're tricking your mind to thinking you yourself are probably writing these kind of lines, right? So you're kind of pre-wiring your poetic unconscious and hopefully come up with something very similar, right? So try to keep a poetic notebook, right? Or a little notebook where only the lines you find interesting, confusing, bewildering by other writers you write into, right? Not your own line, not your own work, right? A poetic notebook. Just another way of you developing more attentiveness, cultivating more attentiveness to your poetic line, right? To good, interesting, bewildering lines, right? It's very important to also write lines that confuse you, you don't know what's going on, right? So you could spend some time later on trying to puzzle them out, right? I have done this since graduate school, and I continue to do it, right? I must have boxes of this little notebook somewhere, right? Another thing that I do is that I only do this with living poets, not dead poets, because it feels very intrusive to do this to a dead poet's work, right? I rewrite other lines by other poets in my head. If I read a line by Natalie Diaz and I say, oh, there you go again, Natalie, being brilliant as usual. But if this was my line, I would have broken the line at this word. I just do it briefly in my mind and I move on. Ricky Laurentis. I love, love, love this line. But if it was my line, I would have reworked the simile this way. I do it briefly in my mind and then I move on. All right. Karen Sully, who's one of my favorite living poets from Canada. Look at what I've done again. Look at this beautiful, gorgeous kind of syntax. If this was my line, I would have reworked the syntax this way. I briefly mess up, mar, right? Other people's good lines or interesting lines, right? What am I doing when I do this, right? I don't write it down. I just think it in my head. I am what? I am just cultivating a hyper attentiveness to my own aesthetics and my own approach, right? When I break somebody else's line or disfigure somebody else's line in my mind ever so briefly, right? I'm becoming more attentive to what? How I think about language, how I like to make language visible on the page. Again, I'm helping myself become attentive to the poetic line, my aesthetics, my approach to him. We're going to pivot quickly to attentiveness to the sentence. Poets should pay attention to their sentences. One of the biggest craft breakthroughs I had postgraduate school, when I was working on my drafts during the revision process, I kept noticing so many of these lines have no energy. All right, where is the cadence? Where is the music? Where is that surge of something, right? How can these lines become more alive, right? And then it dawned on me, maybe I'm just focusing too much on the line itself. What about the sentences, right? A line can be a sentence can be a line, right? A sentence can be broken into 2 or 3 lines or a whole poem itself, right? Sentences are part of writing poems too, right? Poets should strive to vary their sentences, right? Writing the same kind of sentence halts the flow of the poem, lessens the energy of the lines. Sameness sets in. A pattern sets in, right? Not always, again, sometimes a poem requires this kind of sameness, right? Here's a brief aside, right? I truly believe the secret of poetry is 3 words: pattern and variation. Pattern and variation. At the level of language, at the level of the line, the stanza, sentences, subject matter, and the ordering of poems, right? Pattern and variation, right? If you recognize your patterns and break your patterns here and there, when it comes to all these examples, all these craft choices, right? All these subjects you're writing about, you will really, really charge up your language, your lyric poems, your narrative poems. When I'm at the end of my revision revision process, when I think the poem is almost there, I, on my screen, write out the sentence of each lyric, right? I write out each sentence, right? Then I pay close attention to each sentence. You know, there are 4 sentence types in American English, right? Am I using the same sentence pattern again and again? If I am, that's probably halting or stalling the energy of the lines themselves, right? But the key for me is I lay out the sentences on my device, my screen, right? I look at each sentence individually, not really thinking about what's before that sentence or the other sentence. That's kind of the key moment for me, right? I rework each sentence so it's more lyrical, more powerful, right? Without thinking what comes before and after it. When I do that to each sentence in my lyric, then I go back and see how they all kind of can work together. And if they're not working together, I make them work together. Right? I make them seamless in a sense, right? That's the distinction for me, right? I write out the sentences. I make sure they're energetic, they're different, they're more lyrical than prosaic, right? Each one I pay attention to. Then I go back and see how they all work and dovetail together. That's a key part of the process, right? Then I re-break my sentences into the lines again, right? But by fostering an awareness to my sentences, I have learned how to control, right, the energies in my lyric poems, how to quicken the pace, how to slow down something when I need it to be slowed down, right? By paying attention to my sentences, I have become more skillful practitioner of the poetic line. I firmly believe that, right? Ask yourself, and during the revision process, what kind of sentences are you using again and again? If you're using the same kind of sentence pattern, you should probably be breaking that pattern here and there, right? Again, the secret of poetry is pattern and variation. Pattern and variation. Again, I believe in very practical advice you can put into practice. And I believe also in very practical definitions. I told you about how can I define what an interesting line means to me, what it looks like, what it sounds to me. And also when it comes to music, there are very beautiful ways and very kind of theory-rich ways, jargon-rich ways to describe music. Music is just one simple thing. It's identical or similar sounds in close proximity. That's what music is. Identical, similar sounds in close proximity. Right? This kind of definition allowed me to really, really pay attention to sonic structures as I revised, right? They weren't afterthought, right? They became an important part of the revision strategy because this definition is approachable, right? It's not scary. You can enact this very definition, right, into the revision strategy, right? That said, I also developed what I call sonic haikus. Haikus are what? 17 syllables, 3 lines, right? Right? I write what I call, say one of my revisions, I realize I'm missing maybe a consonant sound, right? So I write I say K, a K sound, right? So I write a haiku where the K sound is present in every word, pronounced or not so pronounced, pronounced or soft, right? But every word has a K sound, right? Because you could write that, right? 17 syllables, 3 lines, right? The sonic haiku. This for this instance, a K-rich, K sound sonic haiku, right? So I write out a haiku, but the trick is I write it in my mind. I revise it in my mind before I put it down to paper. That's the trick. What am I doing when I force myself to write and revise that sonic haiku in my mind? I'm carrying music with me through the day, right? It's a very approachable form, very small fixed form, right? So you could kind of revise it and write it in your head in the afternoon or over a couple of days on the bus, right? Walking to school, walking home from school, right? I do this all the time when I feel there's a sonic pattern missing in one of my drafts. I write a sonic haiku. I write the haiku, revise it completely in my mind, so music rattles in my skull, right? So I become, again, attentive to sonic patterns. There's a wonderful example by a former student of mine, Aziza Barnes. It's called Haiku You, which I've always loved this. Urge unbuttons us. Around our sun, urgent turns. Young ruin round ours. Quite lovely, right? And all the beautiful, beautiful sonics in there too, right? Again, I believe in practical advice, things you can carry, right? Most of my advice is beneficial if it becomes habitual, part of a practice, right? This is how I wrote my first and second books. Again, modify them if you need to. Read poet interviews, right? But develop strategies, right, that help you become more attentive to your language, right? You see your strengths and you see your weaknesses, right? Push yourself, dig deeper, right? I think at 4:37, so I think that's where I am here. Gonna end here.
That was fabulous. Thank you. I love the practical advice, but also this is beyond practical advice. I mean, it is so inspiring at the same time of giving me a lot of good ideas of what I can do with my own work.
Well, hopefully that's the goal of all these my craft talks, and when I work with my students, right, things you can put into practice right away, right, or
Yes.
things that you can modify that make sense for your own practice too, which is key.
Exactly. And I like how you ask yourself with each poem, is that an interesting line rather than a good line? Because that word, interesting versus good, is going to produce so many more different effects.
Yes, because at the end of the day, I'm interested in the process, not the product. Right? I'm not interested in writing the poem itself. I'm interested in the process, the journey of writing a poem, right? So I center process over product continuously, right? Right. And it's very important. Often MFA programs, the product becomes centralized because of workshop poems, thesis, right? Understand that, right? I tell my students, my students, that who you are, your practice as a poet, it's different when you're a student. You have these requirements that you have to execute, you have to follow through. But after graduate school, then you can become a different kind of writer, right? Because you don't have those deadlines, right? You don't have to think about the
Exactly.
product, right? You can really, really dwell and center the process, right?
Exactly.
I tell myself, I can't, I said this to your class the other day, the very notion of writing every day or revising every day fills me with anxiety. I wouldn't be a writer if I had to write or revise every day. I know it's different for prose writers, right? But they get paid differently. So they should be working more than us poets at the end of the day, right? But I can pay attention every day, right? So attentiveness is the heart of my creative practice. As long as I'm moving through the world attentive, I know I'm preparing myself when I actually start writing, right? It's part of the writing process, right? I'm paying attention, I'm writing, right? It's part of the writing process.
Right. Um, just one question for clarification. And while I'm asking this, if anyone would like to put a question in the chat, and I'll start going through there and um, asking some questions for Eduardo from the chat. But I was just wondering about your advice. I'm looking here at my notes that I wrote when you're saying that you write out the sentences of your poem, and you really mean sentence, like not just the line, but like if a sentence
The
takes up
full
10 lines,
sentence.
the full sentence.
If the sentence is unfolded over 3 or 4 lines, it all stretches out to one sentence. The sentence. I'm not looking at the lines at this part of the revision process. Just the sentences. Write the sentences out. Right.
That's great advice. Fabulous advice. All right, I'm going to switch over
I'm
here.
surprised not enough poets pay attention to the sentence. I'm like, pay attention. We use it every day. Yeah. A poem has a sentence in it.
Yeah, there might be some fear going back to high school essays.
Well, listen, I can't diagram a sentence to save my life, so I'm not going to ask you to do that because I can't do that myself. Right? But I could, write them out and rethink them, right? Play with them.
Right.
Thumb each syllable out. Yeah.
So Jim Simpson has asked, is there a poet or poets you return to often for inspiration, or just because they're so gorgeous? He's saying the 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 poems.
I do. There are people who who become like North Stars for me. People like Bay Dow, Jean Valentine, C.D. Wright, Bridget Pigeon Kelly, Octavio Paz from Mexico, Federico Garcia Lorca from Spain. I have always returned to Robert Hayden. Is very important to me in the first book, and personally is a very important poet to me. Right. So I think I was talking to Dr. Pence's class about this, right? For poets, especially poets who are working on the first book, right? There are 2 sets of poets that are very important to them, right? What I call the gateway poets, the poets who introduce you to the tradition, right? For me, those poets like were Rita Dove, David St. John, Philip Levine, right? Those poets showed me, oh, poets are still writing today, right? They welcomed me to the craft, onto the page. Oh, maybe I can do this, right? They showed me that it was possible, right? Because of their beautiful, wonderful work, right? But those poets are often given to you. They're assigned to you because somebody saw you read poetry or interested in poetry. An undergrad professor, in my case, said, oh, have you read these poets, right? These gateway poets, right? Often poets who are given to us. The secondary set of poets are the poets who complicate or trouble your assumptions about what a poem can do on the page, right? They're like, there's another way of thinking about the lyric. There's another way of writing, all right? And the tension between the gateway poets and the secondary set of poets, which you find on your own, that's a key distinction too. The second set of poets you find on your own because of an MFA program or you're deepening awareness of what's out there, right? That's a key distinction, right? But the tension between the gateway poets and the second set of poets, I think, is what makes a first book. It makes a first book. It makes a first book. All of you in this room, I'm quite sure, have your gateway poets, right? But have you discovered that secondary set of poets who complicate your assumptions about what language can do? It's very important to find those poets.
That's a great point, fabulous point. So this question is from Natasha Novikov. Have you found that the way you break down a line while keeping the order of words the same can change the meaning of lines or the stanza, or just the aesthetic?
Yeah, just like the last word in the line, the N words, right? The enjambment, just having a different word stop the line or resonate at the end of the line can change the whole thing, can change it at all, right? Just that very thing of enjambment, right? Deciding where to break the line can change the whole energy of the line and recharge the whole stanza, right? Right. Just one word has that power. Again, I think I told this to Dr. Pence's classroom, right? A word is so rich and resonant, right? A word casts many shadows. A word casts more than one shadow, right? This is why I love the materiality of language, right? Painters have canvas and oil, sculptors have stone and wood. We poets, we writers have the material of language. One word casts many shadows. And I gave the example the other day too. The original hyperlink was a word, right? I say the word heartache, I click on that word in my mind, I go somewhere, you go somewhere. I say the word mother, you click on that word, you go somewhere, and I go somewhere, right? Just one word, rich with so many possibilities, right? Rich with many possibilities. This is why I think, it's both enthralling and frustrating to work with language and words, because there's so much there, right? So much there.
Exactly. Laura, Rana has a question for you, and this poet came up during when you met with my class on Wednesday. Laura, Rana wanted to ask you about Robert Hayden's influence on your work.
Robert Hayden came to me post-graduate school. Nobody in graduate school ever told me about Robert Hayden, which I find quite a shock. But Robert Hayden, because some of the biggest concerns I had post-graduate school about my work, I had these questions about my work. Is it too Latino, not Latino enough? Is it too queer, not queer enough, right? And reading Robert Hayden, he taught me through his example. And, he suffered, he was ostracized by his own community sometimes, his own literary communities, right? Because he just wanted to be a poet, right? Hayden taught me something very important. The only obligation I have as a poet is the languages that come to me, that I am interrogating on the page, right? I don't have an obligation to whatever communities I'm from, no matter how beloved they are, right? My Mexican American community, the queer community, the border community. I love those communities. They're very important to me, but my obligation is not to them as a poet. My obligation is to the languages, the language, the syntax and diction that I have to navigate, interrogate on the page, right? But the paradox is, when I release the anxiety about being too Latino, not Latino enough, or too queer, not queer enough, I actually started writing poems that were queer, but queer in an interesting way, right? Because I took a different angle of approach. My border poems became more resonant for me, more powerful, right? Because I let go of the anxiety about writing about it. So I found a different angle of approach to it, right? I keep saying language is not an animal we can train, and it's not, right? To dwell with language, to listen to it, to follow a word or a phrase until it gives you subject matter, what it needs to say, right? It's very enriching and powerful, right? Because you're just talking about a word has many resonances and shadows, right? So you could really spend time dwelling with one word and find so many possibilities, right? So many echoes or resonances, right? But that's some of the things Robert Hayden taught me and continues to teach me end of the day.
I love that. Language is not an animal we can train.
Nope. Or somebody else said to me, "Oh, how about tame?" Oh, that works just the same too, right? Language, right? I like a variation of it, right?
So we probably have time for one last question. I don't know if I missed one in the chat. So I'll give people a couple seconds to put in one last one. Okay, here's the one last one from Shannon Donahue. What materials beside language get you more excited about writing and revision?
For me, what gets me excited about language itself or poetry or lyricism is the visual arts. All right. I'm a poet who wants to be a painter at the end of the day, but has no skills with a paintbrush and canvas. None so whatsoever. My high school art teachers made sure I knew that. So message received, right? But yes, the visual, right? But not only just high art or popular art, but everywhere, right? Like menu typos always make my day, right? The color and textures of things, right? When I say I move through the world, attentive to the world, I mean, my five senses are open to the world, right? Touch, aroma, all right? Sounds, right? I'm moving through the world of my five senses, receptive and open to what's out there, right? And I find that kind of plushness in the visual too, the visual, right? The visual, right? And for revision, I find lately for me, lyrical essays are helping me kind of rethink the way I kind of structure some of my poems, especially for the third project, which I think that is going to involve the sentence, which is terrifying me because I don't want to write prose or a hybrid of prose for the third book, but I think because where it's going is going to go there, which is really making me mad.
That's when we usually know we're on the right track.
I know, it's so annoying about it. Like, I'm not gonna write about that. Like, yeah, you are. Yeah, you are. You'll get there.
Oh, that's fabulous. Well, I cannot thank you enough for all this wisdom and all this inspiration that you gave us today. And I thank all of you who also came.
Thank you, everybody, for your attentiveness.
Yes.
That's a key word for me, attentiveness. Thank you so
Yes.
much. Thank you, Dr. Pence, again.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And we will post this on YouTube on the Stokes Center for Creative Writing YouTube channel in about a month. So thank you again. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank
you, Charlotte, again. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, pleasure's all ours.
Oh, good.